Hello, welcome to another episode of Coffee and Propaganda. I'm Duncan King. In this episode, we're going to explore the immense piece of propaganda, of ancient propaganda, which is the book of Judges. Some people don't have as much familiarity with the book of Judges as they do, say, the book of Genesis or the Gospels or the book of Exodus. So we're going to go into I'm going to discuss in some detail what the book of Joshua is before I begin. Book of Joshua tells the story of the Israelites following the death of Moses. Joshua is appointed the new leader, or ordained as the new leader of the Israelites after the death of Moses. Moses took them to the promised land, and then Joshua took the reins of the Israelites and led them into the promised land. As a child, whenever I was hearing about this story, I thought that the promised land was the Garden of Eden. I don't know why I thought that. But the promised land is actually the land promised to Abram in the narrative of Genesis. So it's actually the area that Israel is now, the Canaanite region, where Hebrews put a lot of their personal national identity in that area, in the southeast of the Mediterranean region. The story tells in the story and the narrative of the book of Joshua, Joshua leads the Israelites into the actual land. So Moses kind of took them there, and then he dies, and then Joshua takes over, and they actually go in and conquer the land, destroying basically every army, every society, every tribe, every kingdom that had already been living there. I often call the book of Joshua the book of blood, because it's one of the most brutal, well, it's probably, well, other than if you're talking about all the people that died in the book in the flood, it could perhaps be called the most bloody book in the Bible in terms of the number of people that are slaughtered in it. They go from tribe to tribe and just basically kill everyone and then take it over. So it's kind of a smaller and quicker scale destruction compared to, say, the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish. It took over, according to the narrative, it specifically says that it took place over the course of about 70 years. And then Joshua died. What its purpose is to say how the Israelites came to actually live in that land and form a nation. The book of Joshua, is it propaganda? Yes, it is. It's one of the most easily debunked books in the entire Bible. If you ever look it up in any kind of at all fair website, they will admit, I don't care who you're looking up, there will be no debate about it. The book of Joshua is a myth. And let me tell you how easy it is for this, how easily this has been proven, and why it's so easy to disprove it. It's in an odd era of history. So we have an era here where there's correspondence. So there are systems of writing that were already established well before this, but there's more correspondence during this area. So we have all these documentations from Egypt. We have documentations from the Hittite Empire, clay tablets that are correspondence between commanders and their emperors, telling them what they're doing, telling them of the battles that they're engaging in, asking for help, asking for resources, things like that. And there's also all this clay pottery that we can find in regions that represent cultures that have writing on them. So we have a very clear picture from this period of what the political world was like, what the political environment of that era was like. Now, does Joshua make more grandiose claims than the previous books of the Bible, like Genesis and Exodus? No, it doesn't. Because especially when you're talking about the flood and migration there, that's a pretty grandiose claim. But the book of Joshua is easier to debunk than those, because we actually know from archaeology, from studies of these tablets and the writing that had been going on, what the world actually looked like and how far apart the claims in Joshua really are from that picture. The reality of that era was that the entire time I'm talking, the entire period I'm talking about, that whole narrative with Joshua going in and taking over the lands, was according to the Bible, and you can figure this out by just tracing the age of the patriarchs and the age of the times it's talking about, because it gives a lot of, it doesn't give dates because they didn't have the BCE dating system then. But you can figure out that they're basically talking about a period of about 1400 BCE to about 1200 BCE. And we know from documentation, from all this documentation from the period, that whole time period, Egypt was still in the area where they're supposedly taking over. And there is no narrative in the book of Joshua that there were any Egyptians there. Egyptians controlled that whole area during that time, which renders it all nonsense. How could this happen? How could people be so off in their own view of their own history, of their own nation? You have to realize that before a system of writing is established, before people didn't have a historical mindset back then. So kings and people like that didn't think, well, I need to record this so people, for future generations, can understand what happened here. And you also don't have newspapers. You don't have children going to school by law and having to learn about what the previous generation did so that they can pass that on to the future generation. All you have is word of mouth. The children just go and they work with their parents in the field or whatever. They don't have a great dedication to preserving their history, so they didn't preserve it. So you have basically an element, what I call the fog of the past, which is occurring in this region, in all regions of the world during this period of time, except for maybe Egypt. They have a little bit of a better sense of their own past than a lot of other people do. Where they honestly don't, they're living in a nation, they honestly don't know how the nation started. No clue. So you have this element here where the Israelites are off by about the founding of their own country by 300 years. They think their country is literally 300 years older than it actually is. That's pretty amazing to us. But try to picture our society if we did not have extensive documentation like we have. We didn't have libraries. We didn't have newspapers. We didn't have all these people writing down what happened to them. And it was all just word of mouth. If you can imagine that, you could imagine that our own history would be quite different in the way we tell it than it actually was. For instance, our own history here in the United States is that the British founded colonies in America for different reasons. Different groups of people left Britain and tried to, sometimes it was for money, sometimes it was for seeking religious refuge. And then over the years, these colonies developed, colonies got bigger, they became somewhat prosperous, but they were still under the dominion of England. And then following the French and Indian War, there were taxations brought upon them that they didn't feel were fair. They had the political and military capabilities of rebelling at that time. And so they did, and we founded a new country. That story is a little unsatisfying. It's a little uninteresting as far as our role in it goes. If a word of mouth tradition just established, and we're trying to alter, and people through the telling and retelling of the story were decided to edit it in their minds to make our role a little more heroic. What they probably would come up with is something a little similar to what the Israelites did. They would say that the Americans have a different history, have a different past. Maybe they would even come up with a different story of how we got the word Americans. They might say that we were actually always living here. This was our land, not the land of the Native Americans. They didn't belong here. We have always belonged here. So they would come up with maybe an ancient Abraham that was similar to the Abraham that the Israelites came up with. So we've always belonged in America, and we were stolen from this land by the British, taken over to Britain and made slaves. And then at a certain point, we escaped them through some sort of heroic story, maybe similar to the story that we find in the book of Exodus, and escaped and crossed the ocean and came here to America and routed out these Native Americans who didn't really belong here. They were living in lands where they didn't belong. And we did all ourselves and formed our own nation again, our own national identity. And so most people can kind of see how we would do that. That's exactly what the ancient Israelites did. The reality of the situation is, as I said, the Egyptian Empire were living in that region the whole time. What really occurred was through various economic issues, internal problems in the Egyptian Empire, and various wars that they lost that weakened their dominion over the region. They recessed, left the region, and this kind of left a pocket for a different nation to emerge in ancient Canaan. That ended up being the Israelites, and that happened between about 1100 to 1000 BCE. Over the telling and retelling of that story in future generations, the political liberation of the people who lived there turned into a physical liberation. So instead of saying, well, the Israelites just kind of left us, we were captives of them in a political sense, wherein they were living in our lands and holding dominion over our lands. They actually stole us from our lands. It took us over to Egypt, and we were physically there as slaves for them. And then we had to escape somehow. So they come with the story of Moses saying, "Let my people go," and the plagues of Egypt, and then the crossing of the Red Sea, and that's how they all escaped. So there's one thing about that is in common. There's an escape from Egypt, but they didn't actually, but the reality is they weren't actually in Egypt. They were always in the area where they are. And there was just more of a political uprising, but it's not as interesting. It doesn't make their people seem quite as cool or quite as heroic. That story doesn't add to the national identity, the way they see themselves as being God's chosen successors or God's chosen leaders for the region. That story doesn't establish them as being the people who have always belonged there. Because the reality is that the Israelites were a group of Canaanites. They weren't any more deserving of holding that land than the Canaanites who lived there. So they come up with this narrative that God actually, there was an Abraham and God told them to take over the region. So in this video, we're going to talk about the evidence, the astounding evidence that the book of Joshua is a myth that the Israelites came up with 400 years. Let's see. The events it's describing were between 1300 BCE and 1200 BCE, and which is actually a period where Egypt was there, which makes it none of it possible. And it's being told in about 700 to 500 BCE. So it's off. So it's 800 years after the events it's describing, 800 to 900 years after the events it's describing, by a future generation. And that has their political identity, their national identity, the forming of their nation happening 300 years before it actually happened. And I explain how that is possible, but it's kind of surprising to us that somebody could do that, but they actually did do this. I'm going to go over the evidence in this video about how that we know that didn't happen. Some of it actually is in the book of Judges. The book of the book of Joshua actually almost freely admits that it was not written in this time period. And with like a lot of books in the Bible, the book of Judges has gained a tradition of being authored by a certain person that the book itself doesn't claim. Nowhere in the book of Joshua are you going to see any reference of anyone saying, hey, I'm Joshua, this is my book. I wrote this, I'm Joshua. But it established a history of being written by this person of Joshua, but it doesn't claim this. And here's a passage that shows us. Joshua 7:26, and they raised over him a great heap of stones that remains to this day. Then the Lord turned from his burning anger. Therefore, to this day, the name of that place is called the Valley of Anger. So this is talking about a future society looking back on this. Whoever wrote this is to this day talking about a past event. And if this actually happened in the book time period of Joshua, the actual writing of this, they wouldn't talk about to this day. And there's another instance of this in Joshua 8:28. So Joshua burned Ai, I pronounce that as Ai, and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raised it over a great heap of stones, which it stands there to this day. And of course, the entire book of Joshua is written. Joshua is always referred to in the third person, which was not the common practice of that time. When you actually wrote a book, you actually referred to yourself as I in the story. Joshua was always in the third person. It was not written by Joshua. Another instance of this in 9:27. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation, for the altar of the Lord, to this day, in the place that he should choose. 10:13 through 14. And the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. We'll deal with this later. Is it not written in the book of Jeshar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. There's been no day like it before or since. You can tell from this passage that this actually was written by a future generation a long time after it. Because you're supposed to impress us about there's been no day like it before or since. Obviously, there's been a lot of days between that instance and the time when this is being written, according to this author, to try to make us impressed by that statement. Now, the only story that we tend to be familiar with from the book of Joshua, that we're familiar with from the popular American mindset that we're familiar with, the only narrative actually that most people are familiar with from the book of Joshua is the fall of Jericho. The fall of Jericho was when they circled the walls of Jericho 7 times. Actually, it was, I think, 13 times, because they circled it 6 times, once each day for the first 6 days. And the 7th day, they circled it 7 times really quick, blowing their trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down. Children hear about this story in Bible school. It's actually the very first narrative that you encounter in the book of Joshua. In that story, there is an element where, prior to going into Jericho, the Israelites sent spies who communicated to a prostitute, and then they promised the reason the prostitute helps them out and lets them come in the city and kind of spy is because she knows that they've been so powerful and been defeating all these countries. So she makes them promise them, well, if I help you out, when you come and invade Jericho, you will leave me and my family alone. You won't kill us. You'll let us go. Here's what the story says about this, and we can find a pretty clear contradiction here. And Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall, so that she lived in the wall. Let me go to another translation of this. That one says she was literally in the wall. Let me see if they all agree with that. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall, literally part of the wall. The NIV agrees. Let's go with the NET, which scholars tell me is the best. NET. Where is the NET? There you go. Then Rahab let them down by a rope through the window. Her house was built as part of the city wall. She lived in the wall. That's supposed to be the best translation of this. She lived literally in the wall. Now we go to 6:20 through 23. This is actually when they are attacking the city. The ram's horn sounded, and then the army heard the signal. They gave a loud battle cry. The wall collapsed, and the warriors charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. They annihilated with the sword everything that breathed in the city, including men and women, young and old, as well as cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua told the two men who had spied on the land, "Enter the prostitute's house, and bring out the woman, and bring all who belong to her as you promised her." So the spies went out and brought out Rahab, her father, brothers, sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her whole family and took them to a place outside the Israel camp. Okay. She wouldn't have survived because she lived in the wall, and the wall came tumbling down. So obviously, this is a contradiction. The wall would have crushed her when it fell. They went actually to her house, entered the prostitute's house, which would have been crushed because it was part of the wall. That's a pretty bad contradiction there. It's not the author contradicting himself there, like he did, like he changed the story kind of thing. He just didn't think about it. He had to have her live in the wall because that was the only way to sneak the soldiers in and out really quick. Have them climb on a roof so to escape the wall. But then he actually had the Israelites destroy the wall, which fucks that all up. She would have been killed. Here's some information on the radiocarbon dating of the site where Jericho was supposedly found. This is an actual abstract from a research article. So this isn't like Wikipedia or something like that. This is where I got this. This is from 1995 when the last really good study of this was done. Sample from Tel Es Sultan Jericho. This is where a lot of biblical people think that this event happened because there are supposedly ruins of walls found here. And in 1991, I believe, there were some conflicting studies done on the ruins there that seemed to match the biblical timeline of the walls of Jericho. And so when you're going through, if you try to search this on the internet, most of the articles that pop up will be articles from that study. And if you have a debate with any Christian about that particular problem, they'll usually cite an article from the study that occurred before this 1995 study. But this is actually the latest one that was a more in-depth study of the samples from these ruins that we found that they think were the ancient city of Jericho that was collapsed by the Israelites when they marched around it. Samples from Tel Es Sultan Jericho were selected for high-precision carbon-14 dating as a contribution toward the establishment of an independent radiocarbon chronology of Near Eastern archaeology. Material derives from an archaeological excavations conducted by K.M. Kenyon in the 50s. We present here the results of 18 samples associated stratigraphically with the end of the Middle Bronze Age at Tel Es Sultan. The Middle Bronze Age is not when the Bible is talking about. The Bible narrative places the destruction of Jericho in the late Bronze Age, which would be closer to 1000 BCE than 2000 BCE. 6 short-lived samples consist of charred cereal grains, and 12 multi-year samples are composed of charcoal. The weighted average, the C14 date of the short-lived grains is yada yada. Now, without going into all the science here, I mean, you can look at this up yourself. But basically, the final destruction of NBA Jericho occurred in the late 17th to 16th century BC. More definite statements about the calibrated ages cannot be made until the accuracy. They have done this since then, and they all agree. Development of radiocarbon curves to the eastern Mediterranean region would be important. So basically, they found material from the supposed Jericho site where there actually are ruins. And they dated them to actually been 17th to 16th century. So this is way before the narrative in Joshua tells us that this stuff happened. So the reality of the situation was that Israelites had a well awareness of these ruins of walls that existed in Jericho, and developed their own myth about, oh, we're the ones who knocked those walls down, when really occurred way before even the story they came up with said it happened. So obviously it had nothing to do with the Israelites. According to the Bible, they were still held by the Egyptians during this period of time. They couldn't have had anything to do with the fall of Jericho. It was probably the Egyptians that actually did it. The second story, now, as I spoke of, there are a lot of destructions of cities occurring in the book of Joshua. Most of them are just sort of slightly spoken of, except for the first two. The first two are first the destruction of Jericho, then the destruction of Ai. And Ai is spoken of first. The nation of Ai defeated the Israelites because they had taken goods from Jericho. They'd taken sacred artifacts. Some of the Hebrews did. And this angered God because he told them not to take anything from the city of Jericho, because those things will corrupt your city, because they're sacred, they're idols basically of other gods and things like that. So you shouldn't have any of that stuff. But one of the Israelites took some of that stuff and was keeping it in his tent. And this angered God. So the next time the Israelites were walking around, they encountered the people of Ai. The people of Ai defeated them in a battle. And God said, well, the reason you're going to be defeated now is because you have these sacred things. So he made Joshua take the person that had the sacred things out, and they killed him. Then they were back in favor with God. So then they attacked the city of Ai. And let's talk about the destruction of Ai that we know from archaeological record. There's a very good article snippet here I have from an article about that. Excavations of Etztel. Now, Etztel is, we know, is the city of Ai. It's the same word, actually. Ai actually means the ruins. And it's actually called that in the Bible, in the book of Joshua. Who is going to call their country the ruins? Anyway, excavations at Etel in the 1930s found that there was a fortified city there during the early Bronze Age between 3100 and 2400 BCE. This is way before 1300 BCE. So we're talking here about, I'm not good with math when I'm trying to be on video and trying to be articulate. I'm not good on math. My mathers are not as good as other times. My mathin's good. I got bad mathin right now. But anyway, that would be approximately 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1200 years before this. This is a pretty distant date from the time that we're talking about in the Bible. So this is actually when the ruins they find here were actually destroyed. So about 1200 to, oh my goodness, a whole lot of time before that. It was destroyed and abandoned. The excavations found no evidence of a settlement in the Middle to Late Bronze Ages. This is the time that the Bible said to have happened. So there's no evidence of any settlement occurring in this city in the time that Joshua said this city was destroyed by the Israelites. These findings, along with excavations at Bethel, pose problems for dating that Albright and others have proposed, and some scholars, including Martin Noth, began proposing that the conquest had never happened, but instead was an etymological myth. The name meant the ruin. The name Ai means the ruin. So obviously this city of Ai was known of by people in the region because it was a ruin. And the Israelites, whoever wrote the book of Joshua, thought that that was actually the name of the town before it was a ruin. Who would call their country the ruin anyway? And the conquest story happened. The conquest story simply explained the already ancient destruction of the early Bronze City. Archaeologists also found that the later Iron Age 1 village appeared with no evidence of initial conquest, and the Iron One settlers seem to have peacefully built their village on the forsaken mound without meeting resistance. The earliest settlements phase, known as Edtel, called pre-urban, coincides with the early Bronze Age 1 and lasted from about 3200 to 3100 BC. This period, an unfortified village, about 200 meters in diameter, large for the EBI, was settled at the site, with accompanying tombs dug in caves on the northeastern slopes of the hill. Pottery styles from this period show both indigenous and foreign cultural influence and may signify a mingling of peoples from nearby towns, nearby areas, and newcomers emigrating from more distant regions. Over time, the foreign elements tended to predominate over indigenous ones. About 3100 BCE, Edtel entered the urban A phase. A large, well-planned walled city, about 1,100 square meters in area, was built on the site. Some notable buildings from this time include the Great Acropolis complex, consisting of a temple palace compound, a market and residential area, and four fortified city gates. Sometime between 2950 and 2860 BC, the urban A city was brought to an end by violent destruction. Most of the main buildings were burned to the ground. A layer of scorched stones and ash covers the floors of the EBI buildings. Anyway, this is going through, we know all this. What they're saying is that they have this whole history of the region that they can discover by looking at these artifacts. And by looking at all this, we know that it was all gone. It was all just not there anymore by the time that the Israelites, according to the story, went there. So it could not have happened. Here's more about the rebuilding of Jericho. In Joshua 6:26, after the destruction of Jericho, it then says, at the time Joshua made this solemn declaration, the man who attempts to rebuild this Jericho, the city of Jericho, will stand condemned before the Lord. He will lose his firstborn son when he lays its foundations, and his youngest son when he erects its gates. Of course, the city of Jericho has been rebuilt plenty of times. Tel Es Sultan, Jericho remained unoccupied from the end of the 15th to 10th, 19th centuries. So the period that you're talking about where they destroyed Jericho was unoccupied in that whole period of time. When the city was rebuilt, of this new city, not much more remains than a four-room house on the eastern slope. By the 7th century, Jericho had become an extensive town. This settlement was destroyed by Babylon conquest of Judah in the late 6th century. Here's Jericho today. It was obviously rebuilt, despite Joshua's warning. Very pretty. This is Jericho today. The man who attempts to rebuild the city of Jericho, the man who attempts to, will probably fail if try to, will stand condemned before the Lord. He will lose his firstborn son when he lays his foundations, and his youngest son when he erects its gates. Yeah, that didn't happen. Very pretty city. I like this picture. White, a lot of. Seemed like there's a color theme almost to the building of the city. Blues and oranges here, yellows here. It's very pretty. Seems like a nice place to go. Well, Joshua was wrong. Contradiction in the book of Joshua, which Matt Slick did not mention in our exploration of carm.org. Carm.org did not even mention any problem in the book of Joshua, just skipped it. Here's a pretty bad contradiction. The Israelites disobeyed the command of the city's riches. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah. Joshua 7:24. When Joshua and all of Israel took Achan, son of Zerah. Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah. So in this passage here, Achan is the son, grandson, great-grandson of this guy named Zerah. And in this passage, he's the son of him. Got to figure out your whole history there, the author of Joshua. Pretty bad contradiction. And the reason, usually when you bring this up to a Christian, which Matt Slick did not mention, but I imagine he would have said, that this was just a copyist error. So what he would say is that over the years, it probably said son of, son of, son of, son of, and then those middle words were taken out. But that doesn't seem to be the case because it's just given as his name. Achan, son of Zerah here. This isn't to tell the history of how it came to be. Whereas this one is. Achan, son of Zerah, the tribe of Israel, soul, son of blah, blah. And also the fact that son of Zerah without the other ones is used twice. So it seems a little weird that that copyist edition would happen twice. A copyist error of skipping the middle names in his description of this person. When Achan, son of Zerah. So we could see how the author there could leave out the names. That makes sense. Where, you know, a copyist to take that. See, what they'd be saying in that instance is that an individual who actually took the book of Joshua and was making a copy of it actually skipped these and just called him Achan, the son of Zerah, and these other passages. We could see that happening once, but it happens in two different passages, which makes me suggest that it's not a copyist error. It's just an issue of the author of Joshua just couldn't make up his mind whether he was the son of Zerah or the great-grandson of Zerah. Hazor. I don't remember what this was about when I wrote it down. We'll take a look at it. Joshua 11. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, the kings of Shimon and Asphap, and the northern kings. I could have played with this word a little bit and made a joke here, but I'm not going to. To the northern kings who were in the mountains, to the Arabah, south of Kinnereth, to the western foothills, and in Naphoth, Dor in the west, and the Canaanites in the east. Blah, 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 blah. They came out with their troops, any large number of horses and chariots, a huge army as numerous as the sand and the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Murmur to fight against Israel. I don't know what point I was trying to make here. Let's look at Judges 4. I should have been a little more exact in what I was saying here. I think we're talking about the name of the town that is discussed here. I think that seems to be the contradiction here. Maybe it'll make more sense to me when I look at this. Judges, Elid was dead, yada yada. Deborah prophet was leading Israel at the time. Go with me if I will. King of of Hazor. I think it's talking about Jabin, king of Hazor. So in this later narrative, the Deborah is one of the judges that is in a future generation. It's actually way later. And I guess she's fighting this Jabin, king of Hazor here. Where in the book of Joshua, Joshua's fighting the king of Hazor and kills him. Captured Hazor and puts king to the sword. And then hundreds of years later, Deborah does the same thing. Jabin, king of Canaan before the Israelites. Yeah. So there's two different accounts of killing the same person that occurs hundreds of years apart. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know. You can kill the same person hundreds of years after you killed them. Let's stop playing. Yeah, let's look at this. Stopping the sun in the sky. This is Joshua 10. One of the most ridiculous incidents in the Bible. Now, this is during the conquering of Ai. See where this happens. Joshua said to the Lord in presence, sun stands still over Gibeon, and you moon over the valley of Aijalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky. It lay going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since. I would imagine. This is by a gentleman named Dr. Sten Odenwald talking about what would happen if the Earth stopped spinning, which the sun stopping in the sky would actually be the Earth stopping its spin. The moon stopping would actually be the moon stopping, but the sun stopping would actually be the Earth stopping. But anyway, what he wrote here is, if the Earth stopped spinning suddenly, the atmosphere would still be in motion. With the Earth's original 1100 mile per hour rotation speed at the equator. All the land masses would be scoured clean of anything not attached to bedrock. This means rocks, topsoil, trees, buildings, your pet dog, and so on will be swept away into the atmosphere. That clearly did not happen. Even in the narrative, and if it happened on Earth, we certainly would know about it. And every country in the world, every nation in the world would have a history of this happening. All this, the sun stopping, the Earth stopping its spin, and everybody being thrown. And obviously, they couldn't have attacked the city of Ai because they would be thrown in the atmosphere and everybody would be dead. This is Bar Ehrman writing about Joshua. I love Bar Ehrman. He is a New Testament historian, but he's also familiar with the Old Testament as well. And this is in his blog. And thankfully, this particular article managed to actually be here. Usually in his blog, he makes you pay to read his stuff, which is fair. He's an expert, so whatever. External verification archaeology for biblical scholars, just as significant is the surviving physical evidence, or rather lack of it, for the conquest. He's talking about the conquest of the Canaan region by Joshua. Archaeologists have long noted that there is scant support for this kind of violent destruction of the cities of Canaan, especially the ones mentioned in Joshua. Think for a second. If one were to look for archaeological evidence or other external verification to support the historical narratives of Joshua, what would one look for? References to the invasion and conquest in other written sources outside the Bible. Evidence that there were indeed walled cities and towns in Canaan at that time. Archaeological evidence that the cities and towns mentioned actually were destroyed at the time, Jericho, Ai, Heshbon, etc. Shift in cultural patterns, that is, evidence of new people taking over from other peoples of a different culture, as you get in the Americans when Europeans came over, bringing them with them their own culture, different from that of the Native Americans. And what kind of verification do we actually get for the narratives of Joshua? The answer appears to be none of the above. There are no references in any other ancient source to the massive destruction of the cities of Canaan. Archaeologists have discovered that few of the places mentioned were walled towns at the time. Many of the specific cities cited as places of conquest apparently did not even exist as cities at the time. This includes most notably Jericho, which was not inhabited in the late 13th century BCE, as archaeologists have decisively shown. The same thing applies to Ai and Heshbon. These cities were neither occupied nor conquered nor re-inhabited in the days of Joshua. Moreover, there is no evidence of major shifts in cultural patterns taking place at the end of the 13th century in Canaan. There are, to be sure, some indications that some towns in Canaan were destroyed about that time. 2 of the 20 places mentioned as being destroyed by Joshua were wiped out at about the right time, Hazor and Bethel, but that is true of virtually every time in antiquity. Occasionally, towns were destroyed by other towns or burned or otherwise abandoned. We are left then with a very big problem. The accounts in Joshua appear to be non-historical in many places. This creates a dilemma for historians, since 2 things are perfectly clear. A, eventually there was a nation of Israel living in the land of Canaan. But B, there is no evidence that it got there by entering in from the east and destroying all the major cities in a series of violent military campaigns. Where then did Israel come from? And I talked about where Israel actually did come from, the evidence. He probably goes into this in another one of his blogs. Now I can bring up Bart Ehrman, and this is his opinion, this is his summary of the evidence, but he's an expert. So I'm fine bringing him up. I wouldn't have done that if it were, say, a link from Wikipedia or something like that talking about a conclusion. This is what the Bible Hub says about when this happened. I talked about the evidence. Hope you're paying attention to all the dates I'm mentioning as I'm talking about this. This is when Bible Hub says this all happened. Sun stands still, 1405 BCE. Northern Palestine defeated. This is the whole time period of Joshua's. No. Joshua's farewell address. So he's talking about all this happening between somewhere around 1406 to 1375. And we know that none of those cities were there at the time. I didn't want to click the Battle of Kadesh yet. This is another timeline given by Christians on a website. Whereas the other one said 1306 or so. This one, let's see here. Israel enters Canaan, 1406. About the same time that the other Christian and that other website says it happened. This is, I'm not going to go to the Battle of Kadesh. I'll just tell you what that is. The Battle of Kadesh was one of the most documented battles that occurred in that period. And it supposedly occurred in the same period that the book of Joshua is saying that the Israelites are attacking Canaan. But the Battle of Kadesh was actually between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. And it's almost in the same region. This is where it's happening, the Battle of Kadesh. And supposedly the Israelites are attacking this whole area. How does the Battle of Kadesh happen? How are the Egyptians here fighting the Hittites here if Israelites are having battles here? And there's no mention of them encountering any Israelites in that. Yeah. These are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what the Bible is actually saying this world looked like at the time. Around 1200 to 1500 BCE. At the end of Joshua, it talks about the division of the lands. It talks about the different tribes given different territories, and describes actually the territory they were given. So you have the 12 tribes of Israel. This tribe's given this land, this tribe's given this land. So this is actually, it forms a pretty accurate, or pretty articulated anyway, map of the region. It doesn't give us an actual map, but describes specifically where they were. This is what history tells us was actually happening in that period, in this same period. This is actually what it looked like. 1200 BC. Bible. Reality. Egypt was still here. This was disputed areas between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Here's where the Hittites were. Reality. The Bible. Now, it seems weird that we would know more about the history of ancient people or the founding of their country than they did. But it's actually a weird reality that actually we do. Because we have all this archaeological evidence, and their whole history was an odd formation of the past. And this is a little bit, I've stumbled a little bit through this video. It's a little awkward, but I gave you a lot of information anyway. However awkwardly I gave it to you, and however I stumbled through it, I still got the information across and debunked the book of Joshua. So I hope you enjoy this video and the information I gave you, and join me next time. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of this, whatever this is, and thanks for watching.